Hello, I'm Joey Dodson. I am the Craig Blomberg Chair of New Testament at Denver Seminary, and I want to be David Capes when I grow up.
Dr. Joseph Dodson. Joey, welcome to Exegetically Speaking. So you want to be me when you grow up? Golly, that means you're an old man when you grow up.
It's great to see you, David.
It's good to see you as well. Great things, and congratulations on so many accolades that are coming your way through the school there at Denver Seminary by being named the Craig Blomberg Chair there. And that's exciting because he's quite a name in the discipline.
Thank you. I told you before, but I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for you. So thank you for your investment in me and countless others like me.
Well, you're so kind to say that. I'm honored, honestly, to be considered as a mentor at some level. But you and I were just
Mhm.
talking a minute ago how the first course that you took was the book of Revelation for me in Greek.
That's correct. Yeah, loved it. It's fantastic,
Yeah,
transformative.
it's a great book, and so a lot of people know Dr. Joseph Dodson, Joey Dodson. But how did you get started reading biblical languages, in particular Greek?
Sure. I went to school at Ouachita Baptist University and took Greek for the first year because it was just part of the program. Made a C the first semester, squeaked out a B the second semester, and was planning on being done with Greek. I was an A student, and Greek was too hard. But Scott Duvall was my Greek professor then, and he put his arm around me one day and said, "Joe, you have a lot of noise, but I think if you continued on in biblical languages, it would give you volume." I think it was this nice way of saying you're loud and obnoxious, and you need to keep studying Greek. And so he invited me to take his summer course on the Greek reading of Ephesians. I was in there with Justin Harden and Ben Blackwell. So it was a
Oh,
great
what a
group. And
wonderful group! Yeah, man.
yeah, I have a lot of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, Ouachita has produced some great young scholars.
Yeah. And then the Lord led me to study under you. So Washington was kind of the moose boosh. And then I get to HVU and got to do Revelation with you. And I don't know if you remember this, but you also volunteered after that class to meet with me one on one to translate through Acts, because all of the classes that were available in Greek I had already taken. And then you asked me to start teaching at the school formerly known as HVU, HCU, and so I got to
Right.
teach Greek under you then. So yeah, that and that was so fantastic. I was as excited about Greek and Hebrew as a mosquito and a nudist colonist.
No, I've not heard that one before. That's pretty good. Very excited then. Very excited. Hey, today we're going to talk about Colossians chapter 2. And it's a wonderful book. It's one of those books that scholars aren't totally sure, what to make of it at times. But we're going to be looking at a passage today in Colossians 2:15 that you point out in an article that you've written. Has a lot of metaphor in it, and a lot of times we underread metaphor or misread metaphor. And what I want to call this podcast is the many faces of metaphors, because I'm stealing that from one of your subheadings there. So what's happening in Colossians 2:15, Joey?
That's such a great question. No one really knows. It goes round and round. Where it stops, we're not sure. But scholars really struggle, especially with two of the words, the participles in 2:15, the sumenos and the triumbusos. How actually do we translate those two? And so the epigdousomenos could be Christ throwing off his sinful flesh. And so he throws off his sinful flesh, and then he sends out in a high-handed parade these rulers and authorities. Or it could be Christ throwing off not his own sinful flesh, not his sinful flesh, but sinful flesh in the sense that this old body. So it's a picture of resurrection. It could be that he's throwing off the rulers and authorities, almost like, get off me, man. I don't know if you remember Matrix, but the time where all of the enemies are on top of Neo, and Neo just jumps up and throws all of the enemies away. So it could be along those lines. Or the way that our English translations usually take it is Christ stripping down the rulers and authorities, either of their dignity, pantsing them in a more of a political idea. It could be a metaphor where he despoils them. He takes away their weapons. Or it could be a courtroom scene where he is taking that certificate of debt that we saw earlier in Colossians 2, and that has that apocalyptic background as well, the apocalyptic courtroom, and taking that certificate of debt away from them. And so three different ways to take that first participle, and that's just the beginning of the riddle.
So apekdousomenos there is referring back to Christ. Or is it referring to God earlier in I mean, isn't that a part of the question as well too?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's nominative masculine singular. So it could be the first two options of those take Christ as a subject. So Christ taking off flesh or Christ throwing off the rulers and authorities. The third one often takes God as that. So God stripped down the rulers and authorities by the cross.
That's how I've typically translated that, is that stripping
Hmm.
them down is it's sort of unclothing them
Hmm.
and in sort of
Yeah,
a public display, which would have
that's right.
been an ultimate sort of moment of shaming the authorities. Now,
Hmm.
when you think you talk about these rulers and these authorities, are you talking about human authorities? Are you talking about spiritual beings? What are you talking about there?
And that is a great segue into the other riddle
I
here.
knew
So,
that, so I'm coming after that. So, yeah.
yeah, so it could be that these are human leaders. We see examples of this in like the Acts of Paul and Thecla in the second century, where Thecla, who is Paul's heir apparent, the next apostle, she is exploited by one of the kings, one of the leaders, and she makes a mockery of him. She grabs his throne and his crown and throws it down and strips off his clothes. And so it could be along those lines. It could have more Septuagint, Old Testament ideas. If you remember Moses, one of the many times that Israel had rebelled, he gets the rulers and he puts them on stakes. He executes them in order to strip them of their dignity and give them this public exposure. And so there are some that are arguing that these are rulers and authorities that are human leaders. Others are going to say, as most of our English translations are going to tip the hat towards, that these are demonic powers that are being stripped down. Again, being exposed, pants, almost like when the Astros got caught cheating and MLB exposes them. I know
Oh
you're in Houston,
no!
so
Oh no!
so it could be
Don't
like a
say it ain't
shaming and
so, Joe. Say it ain't so.
or yeah, so it could be along those lines where it's God taking these apocalyptic powers and shaming them and saying, in a sense, "Booyah" or "in your face,"
Yeah, that's
which
how I've
could.
always taken it. I've taken it as a reference
Mhm.
to the powers, but with the acknowledgement that what is at work in the world, even among the structures that we see, the political structures, are spiritual forces, right? They're not just human
Mhm.
beings. There's that these elements of evil and corruption and such do have spiritual. They're being animated by the spirit.
Yeah, exactly. As you know, I'm an apocalyptic Paul guy, so I lean towards that. But yeah, we want. It's not necessarily a both and, although I think
Right.
that is the case. But which is the emphasis here? And I think the emphasis in Ephesians and Colossians, the twin letter, is more of these apocalyptic powers.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that last threambusas, that last
Hmm. Yeah.
participle in that sentence.
Hmm.
Threambusas. So that's not a very common word in the New Testament, is it?
Mm-mm. No, it's not. One of the scholars named Yates, he argues that this is not a triumph over, but it's a celebration of. And so rather than this picture of marching the rulers and the powers in this triumphal procession, which draws upon that Roman image of the general coming in on the white horse and having his great soldiers and the prisoners of war, that's often how we take it today. Yates is going to argue that this word actually is not a military metaphor, but it actually goes back to the Dionysus cult, well, where it's leading out in a parade, a celebration. So it's a celebration of his enemies. And so here, the rulers and authorities aren't the demonic powers. They're the angelic beings that have been pacified, that God had made peace with and reconciled. And so here, the picture is not a triumph over the enemies, but instead a celebration, a party as they walk through. And so Yates is going to argue that this word only takes the military connotations much, much later in which we read it through. But again,
Yeah.
I still follow the idea that even though that is the case, we do have this triumphal metaphor that the Romans would use quite often. And I mentioned the Matrix earlier, but if you've seen Gladiator at the very beginning, where Commodus comes in and you have this great triumphal possession, that's a great picture of possibly what's going on here. That part of the public display is Christ leading these rulers and authorities that have been defeated and despoiled and shamed in this triumphal procession to show his victory over them.
Yeah. So I like the idea of the parade and everybody's getting along, right, at the very
Hmm.
end. But there's a sense in which that some are facing judgment, and this judgment is an eternal judgment. This is not just, okay, we've made peace with everybody, everybody's come together now, and everybody's in a good place, but that some have been defeated, some have been shamed, some have been sent and are being sent to the eternal, not reward, but their eternal punishment, right?
That's
So
right. Yeah.
yeah, so at the end of the day, you're following a bit more traditional reading in some ways than
hmm
others. But
Correct.
why is it important to sort of understand the many faces of metaphors?
Yeah, I think one thing that we see in Colossians 3 is that the audience of Colossians, they're very diverse. And so for them, one may see a triumph or possession. Another one may see this Dionysus worship celebration event. And so what often happens in scholarship and in preaching is that we just emphasize one of these metaphors, one of these images, and we neglect the other, or we quickly pass it, or we ignore it altogether. But these different metaphors, all these different images that someone that was a Scythian, someone that was a Jew, someone that was a Greek, someone that was a free man, someone that was a slave, they all might have seen these different images. And these different images all come together in this kaleidoscope, and they show us different facets about the gospel. And so, yes, we do see Christ throwing off the rulers and authorities, but it could go another step where he is stripping them down of their dignity, or bringing it back with how it coheres with that certificate of debt that was over us. Christ takes it from their hand. And so it shows that. And so by looking at all the different possible metaphors, whether it's Moses and Numbers, or Thecla and the Acts of Paul, and or if it's the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, where that certificate of debt is taken away, all of those, if we put those together, we see different facets about the gospel that maybe we haven't emphasized before, that give us ramifications for the way we preach the good news of Jesus Christ, but also how we do discipleship and our own discipleship as well.
But it seems to me that a lot of times preaching, you sort of have to say, well, it can only mean one thing. You know what I mean? You can only take
Yeah,
it one way. When
right.
Paul wrote this, he only meant it one way. But in
Yeah.
fact, the ambiguity very often is a part of
hmm
the what some have called the metatextual data, right? Well, we have to
That's
see
correct.
beyond that.
Yeah. And if you were to ask Paul, like, hey, are you talking about Moses? Or are you talking about this triumph for possession? Paul might be like, oh, I was talking about this, but that's totally true. And so the Holy Spirit has a working in this as well. And so I think it's a danger, maybe, of modern preaching to say that there's just one option here, where Paul in himself may have had numerous options, or might, if we would ask him, he might have said, yeah, that's actually a better illustration than what I was thinking
Yeah, it could well be.
of.
Hey, that's a great analysis of the text. Dr. Joseph Dodson, Joey, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
If you learned too much today and your head is hurting, there is one sure cure. That is to share this podcast with a friend. If you've never visited Wheaton College, I hope you'll make plans to do so. We have a wonderful campus all year round. And if biblical languages are your fancy, check out the MA and the BA program at Wheaton College. You can go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. This is the day you want to do it, right? If you have questions or comments, if you just want to be in touch, please email us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks to all those who make this podcast possible. You know who you are. Until next time, thanks for listening.